February 1959. The Soviet Union lies buried beneath winter's merciless grip. Its vast territory is locked in ice that stretches beyond the horizon. In the heart of the Ural Mountains, where Europe bleeds into Asia and ancient boundaries dissolve into myth, there exists a place where even the hardiest souls dare not venture. A place where the wind carries whispers of ancient fears, where shadows move without bodies to cast them, and where the snow conceals secrets that should never be disturbed. The locals have a name for this forsaken ridge. They call it Kolotsayagl. In their tongue, it means dead mountain. For generations, the indigenous Mansi people have avoided this cursed slope, their shamans warning of spirits that dance in the aurora's glow, of voices that call travelers from the safety of their fires into the endless night. The mountain stands like a sentinel of silence, its slopes untouched by the songs of birds, its valleys echoing only with the mournful cry of wind through stone and the creak of ancient ice. Here, where civilization retreats and wilderness reclaims its ancient dominion, the cold is not merely weather, it is a living entity with hunger and intent. It seeps through wool and fur, through skin and bone, seeking the warm heart that beats within. Mortal chests, the temperature plunges to depths that can freeze breath in the lungs, that can turn exposed flesh to stone in minutes, that can stop blood in the veins like winter rivers turn to glass. This is a land where nature shows no mercy, where a single mistake means death, and where the line between life and the void grows thin as spiders' silk stretched across eternity. The forest itself seems to breathe, its evergreen lungs exhaling clouds of crystalline mist that hang in the air like ghosts of the departed. Between the trees, where shadows gather thick as tar, strange sounds echo, not quite animal, not quite wind, not quite human. The snow beneath lies undisturbed for months, years perhaps, building layer upon layer of pristine white that holds secrets in its frozen depths like pages of an unread book written in a language that predates human memory. Yet on this February day, 9 souls venture into this realm of ice and shadow. They are not ordinary travelers, these are the experienced, the confident, the tested, students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute. Their bodies hardened by countless expeditions into the Soviet wilderness, their minds sharp with the wisdom of the mountains and valleys they have conquered before. They carry with them the pride of Soviet youth, the unshakable belief that no wilderness can conquer the human spirit, that science and determination can overcome any obstacle nature places in their path. Their boots carve deep furrows in the pristine snow as they disappear into the forest's embrace, each step a declaration of human will against the ancient silence. The sound of their passage, the crunch of snow, the rasp of fabric against fabric, the rhythm of breathing in the thin air creates the only symphony this place has known in decades. Behind them, their tracks fill slowly with fresh powder, as if the mountain seeks to erase all evidence of their presence, to return to the pristine emptiness that has been its companion for so long. They advance deeper into the wilderness, confident in their skills, trusting in their preparation, their voices growing fainter as the distance swallows them. The snow falls heavier now, each flake a tiny shroud settling upon the earth, building toward something inevitable. The trees close ranks behind them like sentinels guarding a secret, older than human memory, and somewhere in that white infinity, in that realm where only the wind dares to speak and only the mountain dares to listen, they were never seen alive again. That in the final photographs they would ever take, their faces shine with the radiant confidence of youth conquering wilderness, smiles frozen in time, captured by cameras that would outlive their owners. Igor Dyatlov, the expedition leader, stands tall against the white expanse, his eyes bright with determination. Beside him, his companions Zina Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Krivonashenko, their forms bundled in thick winter gear, their boots half buried in snow that sparkles like crushed diamonds under the pale February sun. Their last journal entries speak of mundane triumphs and simple joys. The weather is good. One entry reads, visibility excellent. The group is in high spirits. Another describes their evening meal, the warmth of their tent, plans for the next day's ascent. These words, written by lamplight in the security of their shelter, carry no hint of the horror that waits just hours ahead. No premonition, no fear, only the ordinary concerns of seasoned hikers navigating familiar challenges. February 1st, 1959. Their last radio transmission was scheduled for this date. Search parties would later reconstruct their movements, how they had ascended the lower slopes of Kholat Syakhl, how they had made the fateful decision to pitch their tent on the exposed ridge, rather than in the shelter of the forest below, a decision that would seal their fate in ways they could never have imagined. But the radio remained silent. The scheduled transmission never came. In the valleys below, in the warm glow of civilization, receivers waited for voices that would never speak again. Days passed like seasons, each hour stretching into eternity for the families who waited. Mothers pressed ears to radio sets, listening for the crackle that would bring news of their children. Fathers stared at maps, tracing routes with trembling fingers, calculating distances their loved ones should have covered by now. The Soviet authorities, bound by protocols and skeptical of panic, hesitated. These were experienced hikers, they reasoned. Delays were common in winter expeditions. Equipment failures, weather changes, minor injuries all could explain a few days of silence. But as February stretched on, as the silence deepened like snow accumulating on the mountain, concern crystallized into fear, and fear into desperate action. Finally, the search began. Helicopters lifted off from nearby settlements, their rotors beating against the thin mountain air. Search teams assembled experienced mountain rescuers, local guides who knew the terrain, volunteers driven by hope and dread in equal measure. They spread across the wilderness like drops of ink in water, following the last known route, calling names that the wind snatched away before they could echo back. February 26th, 26 days after the scheduled radio contact, the helicopter pilot spotted at first a dark anomaly against the pristine snow, geometric and unnatural in the organic curves of the mountain landscape. The tent, their tent, pitched on the open slope exactly where no experienced mountaineer would choose to camp, exposed to winds that could strip flesh from bone. As the searchers approached on foot, their hearts hammering against their ribs, they could see that something was terribly wrong. The tent had been cut open, not torn by wind or damaged by falling ice, but deliberately sliced from the inside, as if the occupants had clawed their way out in desperate haste. The cuts were clean, methodical, made by someone who could not spare the seconds needed to unlace the entrance properly. Inside, they found a tableau of interrupted life, personal belongings scattered, but not ransacked, food still stored, equipment still organized, shoes lined up neatly, as if their owners had intended to return. But most chilling of all, 9 sets of winter gear remained behind. Coats, boots, hats, gloves, all the essential protection needed to survive in temperatures that could kill in minutes. Whatever had driven them from this shelter had been so urgent, so terrifying, that they had fled into the lethal cold wearing nothing but their undergarments and thin indoor clothes. And then they saw the footprints leading away from the tent in a ragged line toward the dark forest below. 8 or 9 sets of prints, some showing bare feet, others wearing only socks or thin shoes. The tracks descended the slope in what appeared to be an organized retreat, not the chaotic scatter of panic, but the purposeful movement of people trying to reach safety together. But these were not the footprints of people fleeing an avalanche or a storm. These were the footprints of people walking calmly, deliberately, into certain death, in temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius. On a night when the wind carried the bite of the Arctic, 9 experienced mountaineers had abandoned their only shelter and walked barefoot into the snow. The prints led into the forest, growing fainter with each step, until finally they disappeared altogether into the white silence of the mountain. Behind them lay their tent, their warmth, their only hope of survival. Ahead lay only the vast indifference of winter, and something else, something that had been terrible enough to make them choose the certain death of exposure over whatever waited for them in that tent. What could have driven them to make such a choice? The search teams followed the footprints like bloodhounds following a scent that grows fainter with each step. Down the slope they descended, their eyes scanning the white expanse for any sign of life, any splash of color against the monochrome wilderness. The prints led them away from the tent, away from safety, into the embrace of the forest where ancient pines stood like silent witnesses. To whatever horror had unfolded in the night. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows between the trees, but bringing no warmth to this frozen realm. The searchers called out names: Igor, Zina, Rustam, their voices echoing through the forest and returning empty, mocking them with the sound of their own desperation. With each passing minute, hope drained away like warmth from exposed skin. The trail grew more difficult to follow as it entered the forest. Snow had drifted differently here, blown by winds that carved strange patterns between the trees. Some prints vanished entirely, erased by the mountain's patient effort to conceal its secrets. Others appeared sporadically, like breadcrumbs scattered by someone who knew they would never return to follow them home. Then, at the forest's edge, they found the great cedar tree, ancient and massive, its trunk scarred by decades of mountain storms, its branches reaching toward the gray sky like desperate fingers. This tree would become a landmark in the tragedy, a silent sentinel that had witnessed the final acts of 9 young lives. But as the searchers approached, their hearts already heavy with dread, they began to see signs that this was more than just a tree. Broken branches littered the snow around the cedar's base, not snapped by wind or weighted down by ice, but deliberately torn away, some from heights of 12 to 15 feet above the ground. Someone had climbed this tree, climbed it desperately, frantically, breaking branches as they ascended. But why? What had driven them to scale this towering pine in sub-zero temperatures? Wearing nothing but underwear and thin clothes, the searchers craned their necks upward, following the trail of destruction. The branches had been broken systematically, methodically, as if someone had been trying to see over the forest canopy to observe something in the distance. Or perhaps they had been gathering wood for a fire. Though no traces of flame or ash marked the snow below, the tree held its secrets as tightly as it held its remaining branches. And then, beneath the cedar's protective canopy, they found them. 2 figures lay motionless in the snow, their skin pale as winter moonlight, their clothes inadequate protection against the merciless cold. Yuri Krivonyshenko and Yuri Doroshenko, 2 members of the group, found at last, but in a condition that raised more questions than it answered. They lay near the remains of a small fire, its ashes long since scattered by the wind, its warmth nothing but a memory absorbed by the frozen earth. The sight that greeted the searchers was both heartbreaking and deeply disturbing. These were not simply victims of exposure, though the cold had certainly claimed them. Krivonyshenko's body showed signs of burns, his hands and feet blackened not by frostbite alone, but by fire. Had he been tending the flames when hypothermia robbed him of sensation? Had desperation driven him to crawl too close to the heat, seeking warmth that would cost him flesh? Stranger still, pieces of their clothing were missing, cut away with the same methodical precision that had marked the tent. Strips of fabric lay scattered in the snow around them, as if someone had been rationing cloth for bandages or fuel for the dying fire. But who and why had they left these to here while continuing deeper into the forest? The searchers stood in the growing twilight, their breath forming clouds that rose like spirits toward the darkening sky. To bodies found, 7 still missing, the great cedar loomed above them, its broken branches reaching toward secrets that only the mountain knew. Around them, the forest pressed close, its shadows deepening as night approached, the same kind of night that had driven 9 people from their tent to die beneath these very trees. But this discovery, horrifying as it was, represented only the beginning of the mystery. The footprints continued beyond the cedar, leading deeper into the forest where darker revelations waited. Something had happened here that defied explanation, something that transformed experienced mountaineers into desperate souls fleeing towards certain death. As the searchers carefully lifted the frozen forms of the 2 Yuras, preparing them for the journey back to civilization and the questions that would follow, none of them could have imagined the true horror that still lay hidden beneath the snow. These 2 had died together, seeking warmth from a fire that could not save them. But somewhere in the forest beyond, 7 others had met fates far stranger, far more disturbing than simple exposure to the cold. The cedar tree stood sentinel over their discovery, its broken branches a testament to the desperation of that final night. But it would not be the only witness to the tragedy that had unfolded on Dead Mountain. The forest held more secrets, buried beneath layers of snow that were only beginning to melt under the scrutiny of investigators, who could never have prepared themselves for what they would find next. 7 more bodies remained hidden in the wilderness, and with them, answers that would prove more terrifying than the questions they were meant to resolve. The autopsy reports would read like pages torn from a nightmare. Dr. Boris Vozrozdeny, the forensic pathologist tasked with examining the bodies, had seen death in many forms during his career: traffic accidents, industrial mishaps, the grim harvest of Soviet life, but nothing had prepared him for what lay before him. On those cold metal tables in the Ivdel morgue, close-up of medical instruments, case files scattered across desks, the first 2 bodies, recovered from beneath the cedar tree, told a story of desperation and strange violence. Krivonishenko's hands were burned to the bone, the flesh blackened and peeling like charred paper. But these were not the clean burns of frostbite, they were the savage marks of open flame, as if he had plunged his hands directly into fire and held them there. His companion, Doroshenko, bore similar wounds, his fingers reduced to skeletal remnants wrapped in the tattered remains of skin. But as the search continued and more bodies emerged from their snow graves, a pattern began to form, a pattern that defied every principle of wilderness survival, every logical explanation for death in the mountains. 3 more hikers were found along the trail between the cedar and the tent: Igor Dyatlov himself, Zina Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin. They lay scattered across the slope like discarded dolls, their positions suggesting they had been trying to return to the tent when death claimed them. These 3 had died of hypothermia, their hearts finally surrendering to the relentless cold. But their bodies told stranger stories. Dyatlov's hands were scraped raw, his knuckles bloodied as if he had been fighting something or someone in his final moments. Kolmogorova's body showed signs of trauma inconsistent with a simple struggle against the cold, and Slobodin bore a skull fracture that could have killed him instantly, a blow delivered with tremendous force to the side of his head. Yet it was the final for bodies, discovered months later in a ravine beneath 13 feet of snow, that would transform this tragedy from a mysterious accident into something approaching the Superna. Chirol, Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolovatov, Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignoles, and Alexander Zolotaryov had sought shelter in a snow den, a desperate last refuge. That became their tomb. The autopsy findings defied belief. Dubinina and Thibeaux-Brignoles had sustained massive internal injuries: crushed ribs, damaged hearts, internal bleeding on a scale that suggested tremendous blunt force trauma. Dr. Vozrozdeny noted in his report that the force required to inflict such injuries was equivalent to that of a high-speed automobile collision. Yet there were no external wounds, no broken skin, no signs of a struggle. How do you crush a human ribcage without leaving a mark on the skin? How do you inflict internal injuries so severe that the heart is displaced within the chest cavity, while the victim's clothing remains intact, unbloodied, showing no signs of external violence? These were questions that haunted Dr. Vozrozdeny, questions that would follow him to his own grave decades later, still unanswered. But the horror did not end with broken bones and crushed organs. Dubinina's body presented an additional nightmare. Her tongue and eyes were missing, not torn away by scavengers or decomposition, but removed with surgical precision. The soft tissues of her face had been carefully excised, leaving behind a skull that seemed to stare with empty sockets at some unspeakable truth. Even more disturbing were the traces of radioactivity found on some of the clothing, not the background radiation one might expect from Soviet industrial contamination, but concentrated doses of beta radiation that had no business existing in the wilderness of the Ural Mountains. The clothes themselves showed no signs of exposure to radioactive materials, no discoloration, no deterioration, yet Geiger counters clicked ominously when passed over certain fabric samples. Dr. Vozrozdeny completed his examinations with growing unease. In his official reports, he documented the injuries with clinical precision, but privately, he confided to colleagues that in 30 years of forensic medicine, he had never encountered anything like this. Bodies crushed by invisible forces, tissues removed with impossible precision, radiation without source or explanation. The young mountaineers had not simply died of exposure, though the cold had certainly played its role in their final moments. They had encountered something on that mountain, something that possessed the power to inflict massive trauma without leaving conventional evidence behind, something that could crush human bones with the force of a speeding truck, while leaving the skin unmarked, that could remove organs with surgical skill in the chaos of a winter night. The medical examiner sealed his reports and filed them away, but the questions lingered like shadows in his mind. What force of nature, or perhaps something beyond nature, could account for such injuries? What had driven 9 experienced hikers to flee their tent in terror, only to meet deaths so strange that they challenged every assumption about mortality itself? In the sterile silence of the morgue, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the weight of unanswered questions, Dr. Vozrozhdeny could only conclude that these 9 young people had encountered something on Dead Mountain that existed beyond the boundaries of human understanding, something that left its mark not just on their bodies, but on the very fabric of reality itself. In the halls of Soviet power, where decisions were made behind closed doors and truth was a commodity to be carefully rationed, the Dyatlov incident presented an unwelcome problem. 9 young citizens had died under circumstances that defied easy explanation, and the public was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. The state machinery, built on the foundation of rational materialism and scientific certainty, demanded answers that could be filed away in neat categories, sealed in official reports, and forgotten. The first theory emerged from the practical minds of Soviet bureaucrats: avalanche. It was clean, logical, and required no supernatural explanations. A wall of snow had buried the tent, they declared, forcing the hikers to cut their way out and flee into the night. The internal injuries could be explained by the crushing weight of snow and ice, the strange behavior abandoning their shelter, walking barefoot into the cold. These were the panicked actions of people traumatized by sudden disaster. But this theory crumbled under even casual scrutiny. The tent was found intact, carefully pitched and undisturbed by any snow slide. The slope where they had camped was too gentle, too stable to produce an avalanche. More damning still, experienced avalanche investigators found no evidence of snow displacement, no debris field, no signs that the mountain had moved at all during that fatal night. The avalanche theory was bureaucratic wishful thinking, an attempt to force a square peg into a round hole. When avalanche failed to satisfy, the investigators turned to exposure and hypothermia. Surely, they reasoned, the hikers had made some simple error in judgment. Perhaps they had pitched their tent poorly, allowing wind to destroy their shelter. Perhaps carbon monoxide from their stove had forced them outside, where the cold claimed them quickly. This theory had the virtue of being mundane, requiring no mysterious forces or unexplained phenomena. But exposure could not account for the massive internal trauma, the surgical precision of missing organs, the radioactive contamination of their clothing. Hypothermia killed slowly, peacefully, lulling victims into eternal sleep. It did not crush rib cages or remove tongues with surgical instruments. The exposure theory explained the deaths of perhaps 3 of the hikers, those found on the slope. Between the tent and the cedar butt, it failed utterly to address the fate of the others. Desperate for a rational explanation, some officials proposed infighting among the group. Perhaps there had been a disagreement, they suggested. A conflict that escalated into violence in the isolation of the wilderness. Maybe romantic tensions or leadership disputes had torn the group apart, leading to a deadly confrontation in which the survivors fled into the snow rather than face the consequences of their actions. But this theory, too, withered under examination. The hikers' final diary entries spoke of good spirits and group harmony. Their last photographs showed smiling faces, friends enjoying each other's company. More tellingly, the pattern of injuries showed no signs of interpersonal violence, no defensive wounds, no evidence of weapons, no indication that human hands had inflicted the devastating trauma found on the bodies. As each rational explanation collapsed, the atmosphere in the investigation rooms grew heavier, more oppressive. The officials who had gathered to solve this mystery found themselves confronting something that challenged their fundamental worldview. In a society built on materialist philosophy, where every phenomenon was supposed to have a logical, scientific explanation. The Dyatlov incident represented a crack in the foundation of certainty. The investigators began to speak in hushed tones of forces beyond their understanding. Some mentioned the indigenous Mansi people and their ancient warnings about Dead Mountain. Others pointed to the strange lights that locals had reported seeing in the sky on the night of the incident, though such reports were quickly dismissed as superstition and folklore. The Soviet state had no patience for explanations that ventured into the realm of the supernatural or the unexplained. But privately, away from the official reports and public statements, even the most hardened investigators began to acknowledge that something extraordinary had occurred on that mountain. The evidence pointed toward forces that existed outside the boundaries of Soviet science, phenomena that could not be categorized, quantified, or controlled. This was perhaps the most terrifying realization of all, that there were still mysteries in the world that defied the state's claim to understand and control every aspect of human experience. The official investigation would eventually settle on a carefully worded conclusion. The hikers had died as a result of a compelling natural force that the investigators could not identify. This phrase, bureaucratic in its vagueness, became the Soviet state's final word on the Dyatlov incident. It satisfied no one, explained nothing, and raised more questions than it answered. But it served its primary purpose. It allowed the case to be closed and filed away. Yet even as the officials declared the matter resolved, even as the files disappeared into classified archives and the investigation teams disbanded, the questions lingered like smoke in an empty room. What compelling natural force could account for such devastation? What power of nature crushed bones without breaking skin, removed organs with surgical precision, and contaminated clothing with radiation that had no identifiable source? The theories had taken shape, risen hopefully into the light of scrutiny, and collapsed one by one under the weight of evidence that refused to conform to rational explanation. In their failure, they revealed something perhaps more disturbing than the original mystery: that there were still forces in the world that could humble human understanding, still phenomena that could reduce experienced investigators to helpless speculation and bureaucratic doublespeak. The official theories had failed, but the mountain kept its secrets, and the truth remained buried deeper than the bodies beneath the snow. In the sterile confines of Soviet laboratories, technicians made discoveries that would haunt the Dyatlov investigation for decades to come. The clothing samples, carefully preserved and cataloged, told stories that no rational mind wanted to accept. Under the cold glow of laboratory lights, Geiger counters clicked with urgent rhythm as they passed over fabric that should have been nothing more than wool and cotton touched by mountain snow. The radioactive contamination was not uniform, not the kind of background exposure one might expect from industrial accidents or nuclear testing. Instead, it appeared in concentrated patches, as if the hikers had been selectively exposed to sources of beta radiation that existed nowhere in the natural environment of the Ural Mountains. The levels were significant enough to require decontamination procedures, yet the fabric showed no physical signs of exposure: no burning, no discoloration, no degradation that typically accompanied radioactive contamination. Even more disturbing was the pattern of contamination. Only certain pieces of clothing showed radioactive traces, and these belonged primarily to the hikers found in the ravine, those who had suffered the most inexplicable injuries. It was as if they had encountered something that left its atomic signature on their garments while simultaneously inflicting trauma that defied medical explanation. The precision of Lyudmila Dubinina's missing organs continued to perplex medical examiners. Her tongue, eyes, and portions of her lips had been removed with surgical accuracy that surpassed the capabilities of any scavenger or natural decomposition process. The cuts were clean, deliberate, performed with an instrument sharper than any knife the investigators could identify. Yet the removal had taken place in the chaos of a winter night, in sub-zero temperatures that would have made such delicate work nearly impossible. For human hands, tissue analysis revealed another anomaly that challenged every assumption about the timeline of events. The missing organ showed signs of removal that occurred while Dubinina was still alive, or very shortly after death, before the natural processes of decomposition could begin. This meant that whatever had performed this grotesque surgery had done so in the immediate aftermath of the group flight from their tent, possibly while other members were still alive and conscious nearby. The forest itself bore witness to forces that existed beyond normal understanding. Trees near the ravine, where the final four bodies were discovered, showed damage consistent with intense heat bark. Stripped away, branches withered as if exposed to flame or radiation, yet there were no signs of fire, no ash or charcoal, no burn patterns that followed the logic of combustion. The damage appeared to have been inflicted instantaneously, as if the very air had become superheated for a brief, terrible moment. Soil samples from the area revealed trace elements that had no business existing in the Ural wilderness. Microscopic particles of metals not found in the local geology. Compounds that suggested exposure to extreme temperatures or exotic chemical processes. The Earth itself seemed to have been transformed at the molecular level, scarred by an encounter with forces that left their signature in the very atoms of the mountain. Weather records from the night of February 1st showed atmospheric disturbances that coincided with the estimated time of the hikers' deaths, barometric pressure fluctuations, electromagnetic anomalies, temperature variations that defied the patterns of normal mountain weather. It was as if the very atmosphere had been disrupted by some massive energy discharge, leaving ripples in the data that meteorologists could measure but not explain. Local residents, interviewed weeks after the incident, reported strange phenomena in the sky during the nights following the hikers' disappearance. Lights that moved with purpose and intelligence, colors that had no names, illuminations that cast shadows in impossible directions. These reports were dismissed by investigators as folklore and superstition, but the consistency of the accounts suggested that something extraordinary had indeed occurred in the airspace above Dead Mountain. Perhaps most unsettling of all were the personal effects that defied categorization. Pieces of equipment that showed signs of exposure to forces unknown to Soviet science. Metal objects that had been subjected to pressures or temperatures that should have destroyed them entirely, yet remained intact while displaying molecular changes that appeared to violate the laws of physics. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, found himself documenting phenomena that challenged his most fundamental beliefs about reality. In his private notes, never intended for official reports, he wrote of evidence that suggested intervention by forces beyond human understanding. These were not the words of a man given to flights of fancy, but of a career investigator confronting data that refused to conform to any known category of human experience. As the analysis continued, as more evidence accumulated in the growing files of the inexplicable, the investigators began to realize that they were not dealing with a crime that could be solved through conventional means. They were confronting something that existed at the intersection of the possible and the impossible, something that left physical traces in the material world, while simultaneously defying every law of that world. The radioactive clothing, the surgically removed organs, the damaged trees, the transformed soil leach piece of evidence pointed toward the same impossible conclusion. 9 young hikers had encountered something on Dead Mountain that possessed capabilities beyond human technology, beyond natural phenomena, beyond the comfortable boundaries of Soviet materialism. The evidence was undeniable, yet inexplicable, creating a paradox that would torment investigators for generations to come. In the end, the physical evidence raised more questions than it answered, suggesting that the truth of the Dyatlov incident lay not in the realm of human understanding, but in territories of knowledge that humanity was not yet prepared to explore. The mountain had yielded its dead, but not its secrets, and the evidence it left behind served only to deepen the mystery that would never truly be solved. The final page of the investigation was signed, stamped, and buried beneath a phrase that chilled even seasoned officials: death by an unknown compelling force. No footnote, no elaboration, just a vacuum of explanation, one that would swallow the truth for decades. What followed was not justice, but silence. Within weeks of the last body being recovered, the Dyatlov Pass was quietly closed to the public. No public announcement, no press conference, just a military cordon and a patch of wilderness wiped from maps. The case files, what little existed, were sealed under Soviet state secrecy, and the lead investigators were reassigned. Some disappeared into administrative backwaters. Others never spoke of the case again. But silence has a way of screaming. Eventually, in the following months, families of the victims reported receiving cryptic instructions from officials. Do not speak to the press. There is nothing further to discuss. When they asked about radiation, the mysterious burns on clothes, the tan skin, the confiscated diaries, they were met with blank stares or closed doors. Eyewitnesses from the search party, brave enough to whisper later in life, described things that didn't fit. Some remembered being followed through the forest by men who didn't belong there. Others swore military helicopters were seen hovering above the site. Before any official rescue teams had arrived, photographs taken by the hikers' rolls of film, recovered from their personal cameras, had missing frames, entire reels gone, as if someone had edited the story before it could be told. And then came the strangest contradiction of all: the autopsy files. While public documents listed hypothermia as a primary cause, internal reports described injuries comparable to a car crash. One girl had her tongue removed, another had crushed ribs with no external bruising. Their clothing, in some cases, registered traces of radiation. But even these findings were redacted or quietly excluded from official summaries. The families asked questions. Scientists requested access to documents. Reporters tried to write the truth, but one by one they were denied, silenced, or warned. A journalist who investigated the case in the early 1960s had his articles pulled before publication. A scientist who attempted to re-examine the site was suddenly transferred out of the region, and the files, those dusty manila folders locked in government archives, simply vanished. And so, the Dyatlov Pass incident faded from public view, not because the public lost interest, but because the state had erased the trail. Years passed. The forest regrew, snow covered the footprints, and Kolat-Syakhl, the dead mountain, lived up to its name. But secrets do not rot in silence, they ferment. When the Iron Curtain finally rusted away in the 1990s, a trickle of declassified files stirred the case back to life. But what emerged was not clarity, it was chaos. Conflicting dates, edited reports, mysterious witnesses who recanted, and others who had never appeared in the first place. And then, the most damning detail of all, evidence that the military had been conducting tests of something near the pass on the very night the hikers died. The nature of those tests was never revealed. The exact location, still classified. And the logs, redacted beyond recognition. Was it a cover-up, a botched experiment, or had the group simply witnessed something they were never meant to see? There were no confessions, no whistleblowers, just cold trails, colder files, and a truth buried deeper than the snowdrifts that had once hidden 9 broken bodies. Whatever happened on that mountain, someone made sure the world would never truly know. But the deeper the silence grew, the louder the questions became. Truth has a peculiar shape. When left too long in the cold, it fractures, splinters, and mutates. By the time the Dyatlov Pass incident crept back into public awareness, it had already been devoured by a swarm of theories, some logical, some bizarre, and some so unnerving they felt too close to possible. The first theory, neat and convenient, was an avalanche. It made sense on paper. The hikers, startled awake by shifting snow, cut open their tent in a panic and fled into the darkness, half-dressed, barefoot, only to be claimed by the frigid night. But the terrain told another story. The slope wasn't steep enough. The snowpack was stable. There was no debris, no compression, no slide path. Their tent, still partially standing, hadn't been crushed. And then, there were the bodies, some with injuries no avalanche could cause: rib cages shattered without external trauma, a skull fractured with surgical precision, a tongue removed, eyes missing. These weren't wounds from falling snow. These were deliberate, or worse, unnatural. So the avalanche theory faded, but not the hunger for explanation. Next came theories of internal conflict, a fight among the hikers, a moment of madness sparked by altitude, fear, or psychosis. But those who knew the group spoke of deep bonds, of unity forged through hardship. There were no signs of interpersonal violence, no defensive wounds, no knives, no blood within the tent, just fear, sudden, blinding fear. And so the theories Twisted further into darkness, some speculated about Soviet weapons testing, that the group had stumbled into the path of something secret, something experimental. Aerial mines, perhaps, suspended by parachute, detonating above the tent. That might explain the internal injuries, with no external signs, the silence of the authorities, the radiation on some of the clothing, but no blast residue was found, no craters, no fragments. Others whispered about infrasound low-frequency vibrations generated by wind patterns in the pass, a rare meteorological phenomenon that could induce panic, hallucinations, disorientation. The hikers might have fled their tent, under the influence of something they couldn't hear, something only their bodies felt. It would explain the madness, the blind escape into death, but could it really explain crushed bones and surgical disfigurement? The further the rabbit hole extended, the stranger the theories became. Alien abduction, Mansi curses, portal anomalies, secret gulags, time rifts, theories born not out of madness, but desperation, because none of the answers fit, and the Soviet response so cold, so quick only fed the flames. Why seal the case if it was a simple act of nature? Why redact names, vanish reports, and threaten witnesses? In 2000, a former KGB agent claimed the hikers had been mistaken for foreign operatives, that the scene was cleaned before investigators arrived, that the bodies were staged to confuse both the West and their own people. But no proof ever surfaced, just shadows of possibilities. And then there was the Yeti theory, laughable at first glance, but when photos were released from the group's final camera roll, one image stood out, a dark, hulking shape behind the trees. It could have been anything, a shadow, a trick of light, but it looked like something watching, waiting. No tracks were found. But then again, no explanations were found either. The most disturbing theory of all, however, wasn't about monsters or weapons. It was about one of their own. Some believed that one hiker, perhaps under mental strain, snapped, killed the others in a frenzy, and died later from exposure. But the injuries didn't match. No defensive wounds, no trauma consistent with interpersonal violence. Besides, none of the hikers had a history of instability. Quite the opposite. They were ideal Soviets, young, strong, disciplined. So the theory spiraled into their own madness, fueled by decades of silence, missing evidence, and official indifference. The Dyatlov Pass incident became a ghost story that refused to stay buried, a puzzle whose missing pieces had been stolen or destroyed. And always, at the center of it, remained that one unshakable truth. 9 people fled into the darkness in the dead of night. They did not scream. They did not return. They died alone in the snow, some from the cold, and others from something no one could name. The more we searched for answers, the more the mountains seemed to whisper back with only one word: no. Time has softened the world since 1959. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union is dust. But the mountain is still there. Kholat Syakhl, the mountain of the dead. A stretch of wine-blasted snow and silence where nothing grows, and where no one forgets. The Dyatlov Pass incident has outlived those who investigated it, those who suppressed it, and even most of the families who mourned. But the mystery remains untouched, frozen like the terrain that claimed 9 brilliant lives. In the years following the tragedy, the site became a pilgrimage point not just for hikers and adventurers, but for truth seekers, conspiracy theorists, journalists, and grief-stricken relatives still clinging to hope. The slope where the tent was found remains barren, as if the land itself remembers. Locals say the air feels wrong there, heavier. Still. In 2019, on the 60th anniversary of the tragedy, the Russian government reopened the case. Officially, it was to lay theories to rest, to finally provide closure. A new generation of investigators climbed the pass, ran simulations, consulted geologists and avalanche experts. Their conclusion: an avalanche. Neater, simpler. But to those who followed the case for decades, it felt like an echo, just another empty answer from a system trained in obfuscation. Because the questions still lingered. Why was the tent cut from the inside, not open normally? Why did trained mountaineers flee barefoot into certain death? What force crushed bones without bruising flesh? Who removed tongues, eyes? Why were personal effects moved, cameras edited, files sealed? Why? Did witnesses go silent? And why does the mountain still seem to hide something it refuses to give back? For some, the Dyatlov Pass incident became a cautionary tale, a reminder of nature's indifference, of human frailty, of how little control we have in the face of the unknown. For others, it became an obsession, a puzzle missing just one final piece. They pore over photographs, study topography, analyze autopsy reports, as if solving it will bring the 9 back. But maybe that's the point. Maybe some mysteries are never meant to be solved, only remembered. Because the legacy of the Dyatlov group isn't just in the horror of how they died, it's in the brilliance of how they lived, young, daring, full of ambition. They challenged a mountain. They planned every detail. They laughed. They documented. They believed they would return. And yet, something ancient or accidental or deeply human reached out that night and erased them. Their final footsteps are gone, but not forgotten. Their tent is gone, but the questions still stand. And the mountain, still cold, still vast, watches in silence. It does not speak, but it remembers.